Welcome to the Wirecard Saga,
Season 3.
Lies, Spies, and Corporate Crimes.
Mikhail Reider-Gordon, Managing Director of Institutional Ethics and Integrity at Affiliated Monitors. Over this podcast series, we're going to take a deep dive into the Wirecard Saga to see where it may take us literally across the globe.
The Wirecard Saga is a production of the award-winning Compliance Podcast Network.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, listeners. Good to be back. I know there was a gap there, but travel, illness, bad combo. But here we are, a little late to episode 40. And as usual, there is quite a bit to catch up on. So, let's not tarry. What new developments in the world of Wirecard? Let's start with just ripping that Band-Aid off. EY, Opus, and that minuscule penalty. 500,000 euros. Chump change. German taxpayers, your own laws meant Opus couldn't go any higher with that fine against EY. You should have a word with your legislators. 500,000 was the maximum amount applicable under the law at that time. Does anyone really think that will cover the damage done? Dissuade auditors of other German publicly traded companies from, say, phoning their work in. I'm calling this episode Phoning It In. I know. But EY is banned from audit work. No, actually they aren't. Opus banned EY from taking on new clients in Germany for 2 years. But understand, audit work is the gift that keeps on giving, because once an audit engagement is won, for the most part, year after year, the work is still there. It keeps coming back. I think EY suffered more when the likes of DWS, Commerzbank, and KfW fired them back when this whole Wirecard shebang kicked off. What was that, 2020? Folks, this is the auditor whom the marketplace put faith in when they invested in Wirecard. This is the auditor that Judge Frodisch, overseeing that trial against Braun von Erffer and Bellenhaus, publicly rebuked for their shoddy work. This is the firm that refused to cooperate with the Bundestag's IC investigative committee. Remember, we couldn't possibly allow our folks to testify, and we're going to fight tooth and nail to keep our work papers and reports out of the committee's hands. Thankfully, they lost that battle. A multi-billion-dollar corporate collapse, evidence of a nearly 20-year criminal enterprise going undetected, hundreds of major institutions with loans that will now go unpaid, thousands upon thousands of shareholders with mounting losses. And Opus has to say, "Oh, naughty, naughty EY, give us some of those cracker crumbs that have fallen in the couch cushions, and promise not to take on any new clients for 24 months. Oh, and have some of your culpable partners cough up some loose change." One of EY's executives was quoted as saying Opus's penalties were oh so severe. How did he keep the grin off his face? To put a street term to it, Germany, you punked yourselves. 5 of the key EY auditors who handled the Wirecard audits have been told by Opus to pay fines ranging between 23,000 and 300,000 euros. Yes, that's a pretty wide gap. But let's put that into context, shall we? The average EY partner earned in their first years as a partner between 300 and 500,000 euros annually. 10 plus years in as a partner, like the 3 German partners who led EY's Wirecard account, their average compensation would have ranged from between 600,000 euros and 3 mil annually. So, whilst a $300,000 fine for one of them may mean giving up the yacht rental this summer or now sending the youngest to state university, Opus's penalties on the individuals will only sting a bit, not actually hurt. You might even argue none of what Opus imposed settlement-wise in this matter is really much of a deterrence at all. On the other hand, Opus did conclude that, quote, there is breach of professional duties by the auditing company as well as the individual auditors involved. Now that statement may be worth considerably more in the multiplicity of civil suits pending against EY. And speaking of EY and its legal woes, a couple of weeks ago, the Munich Higher Regional Court appointed what is known as a model plaintiff in the capital investor test case against EY. Now, what does that actually mean? The model plaintiff in this case is banker Kurt Ebert. Why is he the model? Because he's an experienced private investor, so he typifies the sort of folks who invested in Wirecard shares. But Ebert isn't an investment professional. He's moderately knowledgeable of the market, of economics, of banking, so he's more experienced, if you will, than the average retail investor, but less so than a professional. Now, this matter is a capital investor task case under the German Capital Investor Model Proceedings Act, abbreviated to KPMG in German legal jargon. Ebert, as a plaintiff, is claiming against EY roughly €500,000 loss from the Wirecard shares he held when the company collapsed. Now, the Munich Supreme Court selected Ebert to run the test case of investors recouping their losses from EY. Try one, see what sticks, and if it sticks, then you can let the tens of thousands of others file theirs. So the KPMG test requires Ebert's counsel to convince the court that intentional, keyword intentional action by EY can be proven. It is a bit of a steep bar, but then if one looks back at what Opus just wrote about EY, or what Judge Marcus Froedisch said in the trial about EY's shortcomings, that was in the Braun trial, maybe it won't be so difficult a hurdle to surmount. And listeners, I know most of you are hoping for a quick win in the year 3 of the Wirecard fallout. We've got to get something here, right? We've got so many different legal proceedings happening. Why is there no justice? Unfortunately, don't hold your breath for too long on this KPMG case. These particular types of civil cases move at the speed of treacle. There are some KPMG proceedings that have literally lasted for decades. Deutsche Telekom, anyone? Remember that? Not only is this test case not going to be cheap to mount, but it's going to require a lot of patience and fortitude. Ebert's lawyers, Peter Mattel and Elmer Witt, have publicly stated that they hope to get the case through in a few years. Now, as I've mentioned before, the potential pool of plaintiffs is substantial. In just this KPMG matter, there are a prospective 150,000 Wirecard investors. And when considering this test case, the court is really considering, wait for it, possibly billions, that's with a B, in settlement monies. Why? Because, unlike Opus and its fines, there are no limitations of liability when it comes to EY and investor damages. The limits only exist in the relationship between EY and Wirecard, right, the auditor and audited, but not the investors. Good thing EY held itself together, eh? Good thing they didn't split apart. They may need that extra revenue to pay the legal bills. Understand, if you're one of the aggrieved investors, just because the KPMG being filed with Ebert as a plaintiff doesn't mean you can sit back and wait for restitution for your losses. Essentially, you have to get your own counsel and file your own suit behind the Ebert suit. You'll be out approximately €1,300 for the privilege of filing a request for your losses, but you can hang on the coattails of the KPMG if it prevails. Just understand, the KPMG is not going to set individual settlement amounts or arrive at a standard payout for all plaintiffs, as you might get in a class action. If the KPMG prevails, you, the plaintiff, will go through a second step, pass go, and collect your €200 or whatever your supportable claim is. Now, you've got 6 months to decide if you want to join this very slow-moving road to potential recompense. However, Mattel, the lead attorney for Ebert, does like to tell the press that he believes there are stupid amounts of money to be made from EY. He does, however, ponder if EY Global would let EY Germany go bankrupt in order to reduce total losses for the greater auditing firm? A good question, Herr Mattel. Interestingly, and little discussed, EY Germany has been paying distributions from its profits like Henry Sugar through cash off the balcony. Word on the street is EY Germany isn't putting any money aside in the event they are ordered to pay out for their part in the Wirecard fail. Is Mattel's theory spot on? Pay out all the German partners at EY now, so there's nothing left in the pot when the debt collectors come. Interesting. At least in this cat mug proceeding, Michael Yaffe, Wirecard's insolvency administrator, doesn't get first dibs on any payouts, although he too is considering filing a suit for damages against EY. Better hurry up, Michael. Seems like EY is one step ahead of everyone. Now, Yaffe did just win a little victory in obtaining the right to access EY's documents from their audits of Wirecard. That should prove a fun read. Now, some of the Catmug proceedings will hinge on the Braun trial, and if any of those folks appeal the verdict in that proceeding, von Erfe, Bellenhaus, Braun, this could further delay the Catmug. When does this Catmug kick off? Any time between this summer, 2023, and early 2024. And yes, there will be witnesses called and expert testimony to be heard. Now, speaking of auditors, there has been another development. Oh, relax, EY, for once you're not the subject of this embarrassing tale. Just this past week, the Irish Auditing and Accounting Supervisory Authority quietly punished 2 former external auditors of Wirecard UK and Ireland. Wookie! Oh, whenever Wookie's involved, there's going to be an interesting story. And it's consistent. So, as IASA has been quietly investigating Wookie's auditors ever since the parent company, Wirecard, melted down, and it became known that Ireland's central bank had opened multiple investigations into Wookie and some of its former executives, that the Garda National Economic Crime Bureau, that's Ireland's federal criminal agency, had opened investigations for similar reasons: suspected money laundering, allegations of 400 million euros worth of fraud, and the Irish High Court had ruled in that Grey Mountain case featuring Wookie, go back to episode 37 if you've forgotten, Wookie was directly linked to Al-Am, and in the early days of Wirecard featured no one less than Dietmar Nokelman and his merry band forming Irish shellcos and moving tainted monies around. So IASA caught up with Tony Kelly, a former audit partner with Byrne Curtin Kelly, auditor to Wookie, 2016 and 2017, and Alison Gray, audit partner with BCK Audit, Accounting and Tax Limited, auditor to Wookie in 2018. Only 3 years worth of audits that IASA focused on. Now, it really isn't IASA's job to police auditors. That's the ASA, who are meant to hold the Irish accounting professions to, well, account. But the suspected utter and complete failures of the Wookie audits at the hands of Kelly and Gray prompted IASA to use its powers under Section 934 of the Irish Companies Act to undertake an investigation. Because, in the words of IASA's CEO, Kevin Pendergrast, the agency was of the opinion that it was appropriate or in the public interest to do so. IASA investigated how Mr. Kelly and Ms. Gray managed to miss all that accounting fraud, money laundering, and those fake business partners that Wookie was recording. Their findings? They said in both cases, that's Kelly and Gray, they identified a number of areas of, quote, non-compliance with international standards on auditing. In fact, it seems Kelly and Gray managed to totally miss on the overall objectives of any independent auditor: their auditor's responsibilities relating to fraud, identifying and assessing risks of material misstatement, and the auditor's responses to assessed risks, audit evidence, external confirmations, and related parties. Good grief. This is where EY starts to not look quite so bad. Or is it that our expectations of the auditing profession are dropping rapidly? Here's Wookie catering to the porn, binary option, scams, illegal gaming, and travel industries. Picture this, if you will. It is 2016, and Wookie is claiming a whopping 93% of its annual revenue, or 200 plus million euros, as being earned exclusively from one third-party acquiring company, Al Alam. If you've forgotten Al Alam, go way back to episodes 4, 5, and 12. Wookie tells its auditors at that time, Mr. Kelly, and his team, that overwhelmingly its revenue is all thanks to Al Alam. Now, in 2017, it dialed the claim back ever so slightly and said 70% of its revenue came exclusively from Al Alam. And then, by the time Miss Gray showed up for 2018, Wookie doubled down and brought the figure back up to 90%. Essentially, one company was, apparently, floating Wookie, or so they claimed. Here's how Mr. Kelly and Ms. Gray viewed these claims by Wookie. The audit files for each of the 3 years, 2016, 2017, 2018, showed that the first, Mr. Kelly, and then in 2018, Ms. Gray, planned to carry out, quote, walkthrough testing, which was intended to trace transactions step by step through Wookie's accounting system to prove that it operated correctly. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? Yes, it is. What did IASA find in their investigation? No evidence of walkthroughs being performed in relation to RevRec, that's revenue recognition, and no evidence or insufficient evidence of audit procedures being performed regarding post-year-end receipts in respect to Wirecard Bank and Al Alam. And if that wasn't derelict enough in professional duties, this next bit is stunning. Neither Mr. Kelly nor Ms. Gray thought it necessary to obtain independent confirmation of balances held in bank accounts. See, the standard is, when you are reviewing claimed cash holdings or securities, one obtains letters of the audited entity or individual authorizing you, the auditor, to contact the bank, brokerage, or fund directly and obtain independent, emphasis on independent, confirmations of the account balances in writing from the financial institutions themselves. It's right there in PCAOB Audit Standard 2310, called of all things, the confirmation process. For those not up on independent auditing standards, the PCAOB guidance states that confirmation is undertaken to obtain evidence from third parties about financial statement assertions made by management, and that, quote, the greater the combined assessed level of inherent and control risk, the greater the assurance that the auditor needs from substantive tests related to financial statement assertions. Or, for our Irish auditors, as IASA's International Standard on Auditing states, the auditor is responsible for maintaining professional skepticism throughout the audit. In fact, the standards say its requirements are specifically designed to assist the auditor in identifying and assessing the risks of material misstatement due to fraud and in designing procedures to detect such misstatement. Designed that way. In other words, you have to work hard, as the auditor, to purposely avoid the requirements. The standards helpfully point to another ISA standard, ISA 330 if you're keeping track, on external confirmation procedures, and uses the example of how sending out confirmation requests for bank balances could, also offer the possibility of providing requests for information relevant to other financial statement assertions. Two birds with one stone, as we might say. But Kelly and Gray just didn't really see the point of asking for confirmation of the between 177 million and 327 million euros Wookiee reported as its cash holdings over that 3-year period. Confirmation of funds held in Wookiee's escrow account was only obtained from the escrow agents. Listeners, you know the agents' names: Citadel in Singapore and Al-Alam itself. That's right. The entity that supposedly accounted for all the revenue for Wookiee was asked if it accounted for all the revenue for Wookiee. Way to phone it in, Kelly and Gray. Wow. Just think. Another wasted opportunity to have identified the fraud back in, say, 2016, instead of waiting until 2020. IASA, in announcing the conclusion of its investigation of these two chuckleheads, said, quote, "It could not find enough evidence that either of the auditors sufficiently understood the workings of escrow accounts." And these were audit partners at their respective firms. Did they even bother to show up? EY, you're feeling pretty smug, aren't you, right now? At least you had one of the associates ordering sex toys online to confirm certain Wirecard customers actually existed. Oh, wait, actually, EY, you followed this same playbook because weren't you the auditing firm that forgot to obtain independent confirms from Wirecard's bank in Singapore for, 3 years or more? I'm going to pause further on Kelly and Gray for a moment to point something out that's worth noting. Britain's Financial Reporting Council, they responsible for investigating and holding accountable accountants and actuaries under the accountancy scheme and actuarial scheme, as well as statutory audit firms and auditors under the audit enforcement procedure, and this covers Ireland. In their 2022 report, the FRC concluded 12 audit investigations with sanctions. In all 12 cases, the matters concerned audits of FTSE or AIM-listed companies and audits performed by the Big Four audit firms and Grant Thornton. Out of those 12 cases, all but two featured auditors failing to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence, performing parts of the audits without sufficient professional skepticism, and failing to document their workings properly. Worse, the FRC in 2022 still had 47 investigations open, and via 13 cases resolved with settlement, had imposed £46.5 million in financial sanctions. All that, but the FRC's conclusion? There is a recurring theme in these investigations of these audits on publicly traded companies, and it's this: lack of auditor skepticism and a seeming reluctance by auditors to obtain sufficient evidence. Kind of inexcusable. I don't know, at least Kelly and Gray are in good company. Upon concluding their investigation of Kelly and Gray, IASA said it had decided to impose a, quote, severe reprimand on Mr. Kelly and levied a fine on him of €19,500 for his negligence over the 2016 and 2017 Wookiee audits. And Ms. Gray, she was given also a severe reprimand, their words, not mine, but only fined €10,500 for her non-work that resulted in the 2018 Wookiee audit. IASA CEO Pendergrast said, quote, "The failures in audit identified were significant, and the fines and sanctions were reflective of this." Huh? For admitting early on their total uselessness as professionals, both Mr. Kelly and Ms. Gray were rewarded with, wait for it, a 30% discount on their fines, which those figures reflected. If you thought Germany's self-imposed legal limit of 500,000 euros maximum pecuniary sanctions on auditors of public interest entities was low, Ireland's maximum is only 100,000. Let's put this in context, shall we? Bulgaria's maximum pecuniary sanction for public auditors who fail is 10% of net sales revenue. Now, that's a penalty with a bit of a deterrent. After stating that Kelly and Gray's audit failures were, quote, significant, IOSA's version of a, quote, severe reprimand to these two was to impose, after discounts, a respective 20 and 10% fine of the maximum sanction. Wow! What do you have to do wrong to get the already low maximum of 100 grand imposed? And banks and investors of Wookie, what did they get? If it is any consolation to those who may have relied upon the Wookie audits during the years in question, both Mr. Kelly's and Mrs. Gray's respective auditing firms have ceased trading. Small favors, eh? But investors, bankers, heads up, because according to the Committee of European Auditing Oversight Bodies 2022 report, the EU countries that have the highest enforcement rates against audit firms who fail to meet auditing standards are Poland, Hungary, and Belgium. Now, although for enforcement against auditors of PIEs, Germany is up there with Hungary and Bulgaria. But Hungary and Bulgaria showing up the rest of the EU? These countries don't tend to outshine their EU colleague states often, except perhaps in exporting cybercrime. Maybe it's time for some EU-wide audit reform? Think about getting those penalties up to a level where they make audit partners want to actually get out of bed in the morning. Are we finished with auditors in this episode? Oh, no. And we're not finished with those phoning it in either. For those of you who haven't been keeping up, let's just hear what's been going on at the Braun, Von Erffe and Bellenhaus criminal trial in Munich. Because for the past few month plus, in April, the trial featured folks from KPMG testifying, and some others. And let's be honest, the testimony from the KPMG special auditors, who had been tasked, remember, with that forensic investigation of the Wirecard TPA monies in Asia, recall, prompted by the findings of the internal investigation run by external law firm Raja & Tan, you all know this. Well, the testimony didn't do our three Wirecard musketeers any favors. Here's what some of what the KPMG folks had to say, and we'll work backward. KPMG CEO Sven-Olof Leitz took to the stand and really did Braun no favors by telling the court that Braun repeatedly threw up obstructions, attempted to unduly influence the audit team, and even threatened legal action. Not a good look. Now, we all know the outcome of that audit. No money, honey. Smoke and mirrors. But Leitz recounted some of the more bizarre interactions with the Wirecard executive team as KPMG was trying to forensically piece together if there was money and where it may have moved. He recounted that when he told Braun the auditing team couldn't locate the TPA monies, Braun responded, quote, "Trust me, it's all there. I have mastery knowledge." Masterly? Wait. Marcus, if you had masterly knowledge, how does that square with your now claim of total ignorance? I hate to point out that the two claims are incompatible, but pick one and then stick with it. But of course, this is Wirecard, so it got weirder. After Braun claims mastery, Jan Marszalek, that lovable tool of Russia and Bond fantasist, quipped to the KPMG team, quote, "Who else should have the money? Kim Jong-il, maybe?" Funny you mention the North Koreans, Jan, seeing as it appears you were helping launder criminal proceeds for them that were flowing back to their nuclear missile program. That may have been the first quasi-honest statement uttered from Marszalek's lips, and that's saying something. Light dryly noted that both Braun's mastery and Marszalek's flippant response about Lil' Kim set off the alarm bells, so to speak. Recall, KPMG was examining only the balance sheets from 2016 to 2018 in that special audit. You know, the same ones over at Wookie that Kelly and Gray were looking at. Jesus. Nonetheless, Lights recounted Wirecard management dragging their feet. Go figure. I guess they were so accustomed to EY not bothering to verify any claims they made, they just didn't know how to respond when KPMG actually wanted to conduct independent confirmations, including wanting to review the contracts with the TPAs and trace where the cash was flowing. Well, the contracts and transaction data were not handed over as requested, and, alas, the cash flows were not traceable. As Lights told the court, quote, there had been no substantial findings that would have led to the need for correction to Wirecard's annual financial statements in the 2016, 2017, and 2018 investigation period. And at the time the KPMG team arrived on scene, quote, there were no indications of discrepancies between Wirecard's reported sales and the account balances. But then, as Light also pointed out, EY was responsible for checking Wirecard's balance sheets, and he made a point of telling Judge Fodish, quote, responsibility for capital market information lies solely with the executive board and the auditor. This EY line was something Brown apparently kept reiterating to the KPMG team. Quote, everything's already been checked by EY. Yeah, thank God for that. Thank God the market has confidence in that big four. Then Lights went on to recount that really Wirecard management, quote, wanted to tell us as little as possible, repeatedly describing the pains Wirecard's team took to try to fool KPMG. The existence of the trust funds was only confirmed by a branch of the bank in the Philippines, but not the head office of the bank, which KPMG not only found odd, but thought of that as a serious red flag. Gosh, if only Kelly and Gray had had that kind of skepticism. Lights went on to say, quote, there were several attempts to influence us by Wirecard's strange band of leaders, including a weird offer by Brown to stay at his ski chalet in Kitzbühel. Did Brown really think that this would help the cause? A sleepover with your auditor? Well, doesn't that just say party? At any rate, finally in April, KPMG just throws in the towel. Lights and the team had, quote, lost confidence in further cooperation and said to themselves, it no longer makes sense for us to be here. This is when Brown decides it would be a good time to threaten to sue KPMG. Of course, he also cajoles, wheedles, and tries to bargain, which sounds more like the 7 steps to acceptance of death. Maybe Braun knew ultimately this would be the death of Wirecard. Lights was followed on the stand by KPMG forensic partner Alexander Geshonek. Now, remember, Geshonek was the guy who a couple of years ago told Germany's IC that these forensic audits, they're not really, quote, rocket science, and that what they, KPMG, had done could easily have been handled by EY, if they'd so been bothered. Or Kelly and Gray at Wookie. As Geshonek noted in a KPMG study on white-collar crime, many of said crimes are uncovered by chance or whistleblower, but not the auditor. I refer back to my comments earlier in the show. Geshonek's testimony, whilst relatively short, confirmed what Lights had already said. Hinky Wirecard management, lack of cooperation, and touch or soupçon of arrogance from he who was master of all he surveyed, Herr Braun. Now, after Geshonek came another audit partner, Franz Heider. Now, Heider was the guy who he was the one who actually led KPMG's special forensic audit team on the ground, as it were. This poor guy schlepped to Dubai and then to Manila and tried to get to Singapore, but Wirecard wouldn't have him. Whilst Lice was aware from above and Geshonek oversaw the forensic technology team, Heider was in the thick of things. Not only did he reinforce what Lights had asserted about Wirecard's former management being not just uncooperative, but actually taking pains to obstruct the team's effort, he called the audit sluggish and tough. He told Judge Fodish, quote, key documents didn't arrive until the bitter end or came late. Appointments were repeatedly postponed. As an example of these delays with appointments or interviews, Heider cited attempts to talk to Oliver Ballenhaus during the audit in trying to obtain clarifications around certain financial figures that had been recorded by Ballenhaus. Heider recalled one of his first meetings with Ballenhaus in December 2019, which he said really wasn't all that productive. And then little Ollie essentially just vanished. He disappeared and made himself unavailable. He really just achieved prestige rank 55 in Call of Duty and didn't dare set his console down lest it impact his rankings. According to Heider, Marshalik, who was in this instance wearing his sales director hat for the special occasion, even though by then he was also COO of Wirecard at the time, was named as the responsible contact person for the TPA business, in addition to Ballenhaus and von Urfa. Like that troika for regional third-party business reporting wasn't odd enough, this same cozy club told KPMG that despite being the executives for the entire greater parent company, these TPAs ostensibly reported to, they didn't actually have a lot of data or documentation from those TPAs because supposedly the TPAs owned the data sets and weren't given to sharing with the company and the people who were making processing possible. KPMG was denied access to the computer systems. Heider said, "We didn't get system access. We were therefore completely unable to convince ourselves of the existence of any of the stated sales." Yeah, you can see the difficulty with that. Heider told the court KPMG couldn't locate management board minutes either. Quote, "There were no board minutes." In what can only be called remarkable understatement, Heider said the audit team found the lack of board minutes, quote, "surprising." Quote, "We were not able to trace the business transactions," Heider explained. "In fact, we couldn't find out anything useful." As the KPMG team were giving up on ever confirming the TPA monies, they held yet another meeting with the Wirecard team. Ever the optimist, this team, this KPMG lot. The usual suspects from Wirecard, Braun, Marshalik, von Urfa, Ballenhaus. Heider told of von Urfa being excited and annoyed. Excitement from the guy who said Wirecard was, quote, "a swindle from the beginning." In Heider's estimation, Wirecard side seemed genuinely surprised by the scope of the KPMG audit or report, as if it hadn't ever occurred to them that any auditor would actually do their job. However, no convincing documents were handed over by Wirecard afterwards, no attempts to fill those gaps. Things just didn't fit together, says Heider. Judge Fodish asked about Wirecard's processes, to which Heider replied, "I can't explain it to you. I didn't understand it either." Heider confirmed Leitz's allegations of Braun threatening to sue KPMG. Heider alleged that Braun told him that, quote, "all the documents were available and that the facts could be clarified." And then, out of the other side of his mouth came the threat of civil litigation. Do you think there are two Marcuses living inside of Braun? Does that explain this Jekyll and Hyde we keep encountering? Heider remarked on how seemingly only 2 people out of 5,000 employees at all of Greater Wirecard, missing in action Ballenhaus and weaver of stories Marshalik, seemed to know anything about the Asian business. And that too aroused suspicion at KPMG. It does seem surprising that only Ballenhaus and Marshalik had their finger on the Asian operations pulse because, listeners, you Wirecard watchers from way back when, do you remember that press release the company, under Braun's name, issued back in December 2007? This was the one where Braun says, quote, "with immediate effect, breathlessness assumed, the presence of Wirecard AG has been extended to include the establishment of a wholly owned subsidiary in Asia. Wirecard Asia Pacific in Manila, Philippines has been stepped up to prepare for expansion in the Asian Pacific market." Going on to explain in this press release that the decisive factor was that we, Wirecard, wanted to cooperate even more closely with our network of business partners on site. The release said that Wirecard AG was already cooperating as a payment service provider with one of the largest commercial banks in the Philippines. Quote, "For Wirecard AG, the foundation of the subsidiary Wirecard Asia Pacific in the Philippines represents an ideal base for the Asian Pacific market. The sharp rise in the number of our transactions worldwide is being accompanied by the continual globalization of our products and services in the business-to-business segment. In Manila, we, Wirecard, have now set up a base from which we can strategically reinforce our business with new customers in the Asian and Pacific target countries," said Braun. And by 2014, in his CEO report, Braun was claiming Asia contributed 7.4 billion euros, or 21.6%, of Wirecard's total transaction volume. They had hundreds of employees in their Asian offices. But supposedly, only 2 people knew the Asian operations? Back to Reider's testimony, and then we'll come back to only 2 supposedly knew. Marshalik placed the cherry on top of the Aaron sugar confection Wirecard management had spun for KPMG by casually dropping to the audit team that, oh yeah, Wirecard had changed trustees out there in Asia. To the auditor's dismay, he couldn't provide any information about the new trustee and even initially struggled to name the trustee when KPMG asked. As Leitz had said, nothing existed. Listeners, is any of this really surprising? Let's just rewind a few weeks further in that trial, because what didn't garner nearly as much press was testimony from Wirecard's first compliance officer and former chief compliance officer. And those hair-raising testimonies should have been on the cover of every financial newspaper and incorporated into the compliance training decks of every publicly traded company around the globe. Compliance and ethics professionals, this next bit is really for you. Both Christine Alfeld and Daniel Steinhoff, former Wirecard CCO Steinhoff, testified before the KPMG crew did. Now, Steinhoff told the Munich court of how both Wirecard management and board members hindered his work at every turn. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Talk about a reason to walk away from your job. But he didn't. Steinhoff joined Wirecard in 2013, so he had a fair run with this dirty company. Poor guy. It was his first job as a lawyer. He graduates from law school and he joins Wirecard's legal department. Brutal. Talk about baptism by fire. Now, I've spoken in this podcast series about this and in Teaching Wirecard's case study, but it bears repeating. Wirecard, the globally publicly traded company, didn't actually have a corporate compliance department until 2019. That's right, the little company that just grew and grew into the global behemoth. For years, it didn't have a formal compliance department. Nada. Yet. None. They tried a regional one out in Asia, briefly, but that was run by a guy who used to be a web designer and spent most of his time registering domains for his porn sites. Not the most auspicious of starts to a centrally important internal department. Board, CEOs, investors, compliance is not the thing to procrastinate in business. Just in case you weren't clear. Wirecard had been going on for nearly 20 years before headquarters gets around to a compliance function. Now, we learned from another lawyer who testified before Steinhoff about the nascent days of the compliance department. Christine Alfeld was hired back in 2017, so Steinhoff was there but sitting over in legal department. Alfeld was tasked with setting up compliance management function at Wirecard headquarters. She testified when asked how big the compliance team was, that it was quite small. So small, in fact, it consisted only of her. Poor Alfeld. She told the court that, quote, compliance was not very important at Wirecard. In fact, her miniature department of one which was managed as a side group by the deputy head of legal, was vilified by management within Wirecard as a, quote, hindrance to success. Alfeld recounted that von Urfa had once told her compliance was, quote, bad for business. Yes, when breaking the law is the business, then compliance with laws and regulations would create some tensions with the business model. Alfeld testified her compliance department of one lacked all necessary independence. Breaking the rules was part of the corporate culture, she said. She was vague on her reaction at the time to an environment where clearly laws were being broken, as she herself testified that violations of the rules in day-to-day work seemed to have been just, quote, part of the corporate culture. Little too cheery about that, Christine. Providing an example of the attitude at Wirecard, she told of employees' use of mobile devices and apps to conceal conversations and activities. According to Alfeld, apps such as Telegram and WhatsApp were prohibited at Wirecard under its own compliance regulations. Truly, I love that somebody went to the trouble of publishing a written compliance manual in the midst of this otherwise completely lawless company. But despite these apps being banned, they were the common means of communication for most employees. It was Marszalek who actually introduced Telegram at Wirecard as the form of communication of choice because it was particularly hack-proof, said Alfred, or so Marszalek is alleged to have claimed. According to Alfeld, Marszalek himself spurned all corporate computers and company-issued mobile phones and only used his own bring-your-own device there at the company. Alfeld also claimed Marszalek also used even a special voice encryption program. Mr. Bond, Herr Marszalek, quote, was always afraid of being spied on. Sigh. And now we have to add hypocrisy to his litany of sins. How tedious. What else ended up on the compliance officer's desk during Alfeld's brief tenure? Apparently, with some regularity, highly dubious questions and requests, oftentimes having to do with none other than Marszalek. Alfeld claimed colleagues from other departments sent her emails asking for guidance on how to direct Marszalek's business practices. Alfeld provided examples of incidents that had been raised to her by other employees. Marszalek, for instance, had concluded various consulting contracts on his own, some with monthly fees of 10,000 euros, without the service to be provided actually being specified in the contract. In another case, an alleged consultant from Lithuania was named as the contractual partner, but then a bill showed up for them from London. And in another instance, Alfeld and her manager in legal were informed of a dubious case in which proof of payments to a former Libyan intelligence officer were being sought. This would be the monies that went to El Obat. Now, Alfeld claimed on the stand that she repeatedly pointed out the problems in these contracts and pushed for changes, but said apparently nobody was interested. Quote, "You often never saw the contracts again." Okay, Christine, and did you think to raise this with the supervisory board? When asked about proof of performance, it was said regularly, Jan does that, Marszalek. In many cases, Marszalek apparently did without the involvement of the in-house lawyers entirely. But one does wonder what point Alfeld served, as she doesn't appear to have been too bothered by the fact everyone at Wirecard just ignored her and her concerns. Alfeld claimed that after the denouement of Wirecard and the tuck-tail runaway by Marszalek, when she and others searched Yanni Baby's office lair, they found various consultancy contracts which appeared to have been executed but didn't bear any of the hallmarks of the required sign-offs from other relevant Wirecard departments. Funny thing, those contracts with the TPAs in Asia, the ones that have been what KPMG was looking at or looking for, those were located and they too lacked sign-offs from the internal departments that should have reviewed them. How many missed opportunities to identify this catastrophic fraud must we come across on a weekly basis? Imagine if she, or someone else from legal or contracts, actually pushed a little harder, maybe prevented the contracts from going out, and then raised up the question of why these deals were being signed at all. Imagine if compliance or legal had taken action. maybe raise their concerns to law enforcement or regulators. From Auffeld's viewpoint, outside of a narrow circle of insiders, she had the impression that anyone who might have noticed the company's various frauds were being systematically kept ignorant. Again, one has to ask, if Auffeld and even just the other lawyers at the company knew they were being kept in the dark about the company's activities, and they had observed employees ignoring both internal rules and actual laws, why did they just keep hanging around collecting their paychecks rather than quitting or reporting this to law enforcement? This seems less like being kept ignorant and more willful blindness. Just how many employees does it take to ignore patently obvious illegality? I think there's a light bulb joke in that question somewhere. Funny thing, Auffeld, maybe not so funny, testified that this was why Steinhoff was promoted to CO. The investigation by Rajan Tan out in Singapore was concluded and KPMG had started their special audit. So in late 2019, when the indications of gross violations of the law at Wirecard could no longer be easily concealed, then it was decided to have Steinhoff build a more formal compliance department, as Auffeld's team of one didn't seem to be cutting it. According to Auffeld, under Steinhoff, the new whopping 4-person compliance department carried out a, quote, reality check on Wirecard's third-party partner transactions, in parallel with what KPMG was still trying to do. Only in the course of these investigations did it finally dawn on Auffeld that, all those TPA contracts with business partners that only Marshalik had crafted and overseen were apparently all an invention on a massive scale. After spending the day telling us on the stand at the Munich trial that no one at the company obeyed the rules, the place was lawless, Marshalik engaged in highly dubious business transactions on behalf of Wirecard and purposely encrypted his communications and activities to keep them from the rest of the company, Auffeld claimed it was a shock, her words, when it was discovered the $1.9 billion couldn't be located. Really, Christine? A shock? You're a lawyer who is watching all of this from the inside, yet you're dumbfounded to discover there was fraud after telling us everyone was flouting the rules? Seriously? When asked by Derlam, Braun's defense counsel, Auffeld couldn't recall any specific evidence that Braun was involved in that particular crime. So let's turn back to poor Steinhoff in the legal department and a few years into his tenure. So in 2019, the company says, hey, let's do something new and crazy and form a formal compliance department. So they do, and they task poor Daniel with leading it. As I keep saying, Wirecard was formed entirely for the purposes of illegality, hence really no need to have a compliance and ethics function because, well, obeying laws and regulations and engaging in good corporate governance and conduct would have meant the business model of fraud wouldn't have been compatible. Steinhoff testified that whenever he raised objections or asked questions about the details of particular transactions or contracts, those pesky contracts again, or activities, his efforts too were thwarted. At least he didn't just shrug and wander back to his office, Christine seems to have done. Steinhoff told the court Wirecard's legal department was viewed as a, quote, advisory institution within the company and, importantly, had been conferred absolutely no veto power over anything. Now, if there are any listeners out there unclear on the basics of a compliance and ethics program, this is not how to run a compliance or legal department in any entity. And no, I'm not just saying this because of professional bias. Steinhoff spoke of frequently being slowed down from those above him. Quote, it wasn't an organization geared toward control processes. Another master of understatement. When the allegations about fraud and inaccuracies were first raised out of the Singapore office, it was Steinhoff who traveled out there. And it was he who retained Rajan Tan to investigate. Now, this is before his official CEO appointment. So, of course, Wirecard's management board and executive leadership took him promptly off the matter and assigned none other than Marszalek to take over. Gosh, Braun, how do you explain that one? It's almost as if certain board members and Herr Braun knew there was something to cover up. Move the CEO out so the criminal leading the Asian fraud effort could direct the investigation into his own fabrications. Of course, ultimately, the press is asking awkward questions, the whistleblower complaints are clogging the hotline, and by the fall of 2019, the card supervisory board is hiring KPMG. So to work with KPMG, Steinhoff testified that he was shipped out to the Philippines to work with the auditors out there and to meet Wirecard's account trustee and verify those missing billions. What was priceless was Steinhoff on the stand, describing to Judge Fodish what he and the auditors found when they got to Manila. He recounted that the bank the group traveled to was, quote, on a third world street. Offense aside, I think he meant it didn't look like a glossy glass tower in the center of a bustling financial district. And once inside was found to consist of, quote, only 3 or 4 counters. Listen, had the money really been there, looks wouldn't have mattered. We, of course, know what Steinhoff and the auditors didn't find. Braun keeps swearing the monies were real. Maybe the funds were moved to Veneta. Steinhoff didn't look particularly comfortable on the stand, and I don't know if that was the pain of reliving those days or maybe he just had a bad bratwurst at lunch. Importantly, his testimony that, quote, obtaining documentation was difficult, finding people for appointments and meetings was also difficult and took longer than expected, and that even Wirecard's own management board was, quote, not overly interested in compliance with the law. They wouldn't be, given that Marszalek was one of the board members, would they? In fact, when the FT relaunched their investigative reporting of Wirecard in 2019, Steinhoff told the court that the board, management board that is, did absolutely nothing to investigate the allegations. Quote, my impression was that they, the board, were not actively involved in substantive discussions about that damning story. Again, this is where we stop and ask, why Steinhoff stayed on as long as he did. Steinhoff observed that the compliance department was too small from the outset. Yeah, 4 people, but you were tasked with leading it. So then what happened? What happened to leading it? Steinhoff told Judge Fodish that he wasn't entirely confident in the company and its management in terms of ethics and activities. Herr Steinhoff, is this just Monday morning quarterbacking, or are you admitting you didn't think they had any ethics and that their activities were dodgy at the time? Only you, turned a blind eye? His take on the establishment of the compliance department? It was a pro forma, quote, effort, quote, my understanding was that this was some formal check boxes, but that it didn't mean a genuine commitment to good corporate behavior. No, if management is consistently seeking to derail any efforts, including yours, Herr Steinhoff, made to investigate allegations of fraud or unethical behavior, or toward bringing the company into compliance, it speaks volumes. Steinhoff may not have directly pointed a finger at Braun, but he certainly didn't help his defense. Still, inquiring minds want to know, Herr Steinhoff, why did you stay at Wirecard for nearly 7 years? Why did you stay in a role where you understood to be nothing but a program in name only? Why, as a lawyer, a sworn officer of the court, after acknowledging having doubts about management ethics, did you continue to work for the company? By the time Wirecard's supervisory board had hired James Fries, who testified last week in Braun et al. Proceedings, the notion of compliance at the company was, let's face it, too little, too late. Fries testified that he recalled first speaking with Braun on Valentine's Day by phone. Supposedly, Wirecard had had a sudden change of heart, oh how cute, Valentine's Day heart, about the concept of compliance. As Fries claimed in his testimony, the company had the idea that he should, quote, oversee the KPMG project and professionalize the compliance department. Bit of a snub towards Steinhoff, who labored for so many years. And nonetheless, you know what happened. Fries was hired as CCO, technically Chief Legal and Compliance Officer, CLCO, who was not slated to take up his role until July 1st, 2020. Oops, best laid plans. Fries was appointed by Wirecard Supervisory Board in the spring of that year, and it would seem Fries was given early access to what KPMG wasn't finding. Fries testified that he was immediately suspicious of the claimed funds in the Asian TPA trust account. As he observed, Wirecard had seemingly never paid fees or interest on said mystery account. As Fries so aptly put it, it was, quote, economically unimaginable. And one does struggle to call to mind a single bank that would allow 1.9 billion euros to sit in an account without leveraging a wee fee or allowing Wirecard to go without paying custody interest. Even more unimaginable was the idea that Wirecard management, Braun and Marshalik, had ordered the transfer of 400 million from said 1.9 billion via a mobile phone. Fries, unsurprisingly, observed that he'd never heard of a transaction that featured such an amount being transferred via mobile phone before. Of course, as we all know, chaos ensued after the KPMG report. Braun steps down as CEO on June 17th. Next day, Fries, for what it was briefly worth, appointed as interim CEO for all of a hot minute. Listeners, we've only really begun to dig into some of the goings-on within Wirecard that Steinhoff and Affeldt alluded to. We haven't finished probing why so many employees and so many external professionals went along for so many years with the corporate management's litany of rule-flouting, unethical behavior, and illegal conduct. This goes way beyond just an ineffectual compliance department. We've run out of time in this episode, but next week, we'll surface some of that bad behavior via the complaint Matthew Earle filed against Jones Day and Kroll Associates UK Limited. We'll take a quick gander at some new entities that have come to light via the Hermes lawsuit in the UK. W360 WAM and 361 will be looking at you. And we'll head back to Austria to catch up on the criminal charges filed against DSurf and how that fits in with Marshalik, the Vulcan files, and Cyan. So much more to unravel. It ain't over till it's over. As always, my thanks to you listeners, and my thanks to the Compliance Podcast Network and the ever-patient, gracious Tom Fox. I'm Mikhail Reider-Gordon with Affiliated Monitors. Professor Gordon, to my students, I'll see you back here next week. Same time, same place.
This is Tom Fox. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wirecard Saga. The Wirecard Saga is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. I hope you will join us again for our next episode.